September 16, 1992, 8:30 a.m. London, George Soros picked up the phone and gave the order. Sell $10 billion worth of pounds, immediately, all of it. Across trading floors in New York, London and Hong Kong, his quantum fund began dumping British pounds by the hundreds of millions within minutes. The pound was falling. The Bank of England's screens lit up red. Currency traders around the world saw what was happening and joined the attack. By 9 a.m. the pound had lost 1% of its value. The Bank of England fought back. They bought pounds hundreds of millions worth, then billions. They raised interest rates from 10% to 12%, then to 15% all in the same day. They threatened criminal prosecution for speculators. They called in political favors. They did everything a central bank can do to defend its currency. It didn't matter. By 7:15 p.m. that evening, the Chancellor of the Exchequer stood before cameras and announced that Britain was withdrawing the pound from the European exchange rate mechanism. The Bank of England had spent $27 billion trying to defend the currency. They had failed. George Soros made $1 billion in a single day. The Bank of England, one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, had been broken by a hedge fund manager betting against them. This is the story of how one man destroyed a currency peg that governments across Europe had sworn to defend, and why the same attack is being repeated today against Turkey, Argentina and Pakistan. To understand what happened on September 16, 1992, you need to understand the European exchange rate mechanism. The EURM was created in 1979 as a precursor to the euro. European countries agreed to keep their currencies within narrow bands against each other. The pound, for example, was supposed to stay within 6% of its central rate against the Deutschmark. If your currency started to fall outside the band, your central bank was required to intervene by your own currency. Raise interest rates, do whatever it takes to get back inside the band. Britain joined the ERM in October 1990 at an entry rate many economists considered too high. The pound was pegged at 295 Deutschmarks. Critics argued this overvalued the pound by 10 to 15%. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had resisted joining for years, correctly predicting the problems an overvalued entry rate would cause. But political pressure from pro-European factions in her own party forced her hand. The overvalued entry made British exports more expensive and imports cheaper. The trade deficit widened. Manufacturing struggled. By 1992, Britain was in its worst recession since the 1980s. Unemployment exceeded 2.5 million. Housing prices had fallen 20% from their 1989 peak. Repossessions hit record highs. The economy was contracting. The system worked fine when economies moved in sync, but by 1992, they didn't. Germany had just reunified in 1990. The Bundesbank was raising interest rates aggressively to fight inflation caused by reunification spending. East German integration required massive government expenditure. The Bundesbank, independent and inflation-obsessed, raised rates to prevent overheating. By September 1992, German interest rates had reached 9.75%, the highest in decades. High German interest rates meant other ERM countries had to keep their rates high too, or their currencies would fall against the Deutschmark and exit the band. This was the fundamental flaw of the ERM. It forced all member countries to follow German monetary policy regardless of their domestic economic needs. Britain's economy was in recession. Unemployment was rising. Housing prices were falling. The economy needed lower interest rates to stimulate growth. Businesses needed cheaper credit. Homeowners needed relief from mortgage payments. But ERM membership required high rates to keep the pound strong against the Deutsche. Britain was trapped. The economy required one policy. The currency peg required the opposite. The pound was supposed to stay above 2,778 Deutschmarks by September 1992. Keeping it there required the Bank of England to buy pounds constantly. Every day, billions of pounds worth of selling pressure. The bank spent its foreign exchange reserves buying pounds to hold the line. Traders could see the reserves depleting. They could see Britain was running out of ammunition. George Soros saw it too, and he saw an opportunity. The mechanics of the attack was simple but required massive capital and nerves of steel. Borrow pounds, sell them for Deutschmarks, wait for the pound to fall, buy back the pounds at the lower price. Return the borrowed pounds, keep the profit. This strategy is called short selling in currency markets. It means betting against a currency. Soros would borrow billions of pounds from banks, not his own money, borrowed pounds. He'd immediately sell those pounds for Deutschmarks. If the pound fell from 2.802 to 40 Deutschmarks, he could buy back the pounds cheaper, return what he borrowed, and pocket the difference. The math is straightforward. Borrow 1 billion pounds, sell them at 280 Deutschmarks per pound, receiving 2.8 billion Deutschmarks. The pound falls to 240. Use 24 billion Deutschmarks to buy back 1 billion pounds. Return the borrowed pounds. Keep 400 million Deutschmarks and profit roughly $200 million. Scale this up to 10 billion pounds, and the potential profit was enormous, but the risk was equally massive. This only works if the currency actually falls. If the Bank of England successfully defends the pound, Soros loses money on every pound he sold. If the pound strengthened to 290, he'd need 2.9 billion Deutschmarks to buy back the billion pounds he'd borrowed at 280. He'd lose 100 million Deutschmarks per billion pounds shorted. With 10 billion pounds short, a 10% move against him would cost $1 billion. If the Bank of England held the line and other traders panicked out of their short positions, Soros would face catastrophic losses. The Quantum Fund had around $15 billion in assets. Losing $1 billion would be painful but survivable. Losing more could destroy the fund. But Soros calculated the bank couldn't hold. Britain's economy was too weak. The reserves were too small. The political will was cracking. He had studied the fundamentals obsessively. British inflation was 3.6% low enough to justify lower rates. Unemployment was 10.1% high enough to demand stimulus. The trade deficit was widening. And most importantly, the Bundesbank showed no sign of cutting German rates, which meant Britain would be trapped in the ERM straitjacket indefinitely. On September 15, 1992, Soros made the decision. The Quantum Fund would bet $10 billion against the pound. It was the largest currency bet in history to that point. If he was wrong, the losses would be catastrophic. If he was right, the profit would be enormous. He pulled the trigger. The morning of September 16th, the selling began. $10 billion is enough to move markets. Other traders saw quantum selling and joined in. They saw an opportunity to within hours. The selling pressure was overwhelming. The Bank of England was buying pounds as fast as it could, spending reserves burning through billions. At 11 a.m., the Bank of England raised interest rates from 10% to 12%. The announcement was supposed to restore confidence. It had the opposite effect. Traders saw desperation. The bank had to raise rates that much. The situation was worse than anyone thought. The selling intensified. At 2 p.m., the bank raised rates again, 15%. Mortgage rates in Britain would double overnight. Businesses would be crushed by borrowing costs. The economy would collapse. But none of that mattered if the currency fell out of the ERM band. The government had committed to defending the peg at any cost, except the cost was now too high. At 7:15 p.m., Chancellor Norman Lamont announced Britain was suspending its membership in the ERM. The pound would float. The defense was over. The pound immediately fell 15%. Traders who had borrowed pounds at 280 Deutschmarks could now buy them back at 240 Deutschmarks. For every billion pounds borrowed, the profit was 140 million Deutschmarks, about $200 million. Soros had borrowed enough pounds to make $1 billion in profit in one day. Other hedge funds and banks that joined the attack made billions more. The Bank of England lost $27 billion of reserves in a failed defense, but the real loss wasn't the reserves, it was credibility. The Bank of England had promised to defend the pound within the ERM. They had failed. Currency pegs depend on belief. If traders believe the central bank will defend the peg at any cost, they don't attack. Once that belief breaks, the peg is doomed. September 16, 1992 proved that even the Bank of England could be broken. The ironic part is that Britain's economy improved after leaving the ERM, no longer forced to keep interest rates high to defend the peg. The Bank of England could cut rates and stimulate growth. The British economy grew 2.2% in 1993. Germany, still stuck with high rates to fight inflation, grew 0.8%. Leaving the ERM, the catastrophe the government had spent billions trying to prevent turned out to be exactly what Britain's economy needed. The crisis was manufactured. The defense was pointless. And Soros had correctly identified that the government was defending the wrong thing at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. The lesson from Black Wednesday is not about George Soros. It's about currency pegs and the limits of central bank power. Currency pegs fail when the peg requires policies that contradict what the economy needs. Britain needed low interest rates for growth. The ERM required high rates for currency stability. One of those had to break. Soros bet correctly on which one. This pattern has repeated dozens of times since 1992. Thailand in 1997, Argentina in 2001, Iceland in 2008. Each time a country tries to maintain a currency peg that requires policies the economy can't sustain. Traders identify the mismatch, they attack. The central bank defends, reserves deplete. Eventually, the peg breaks. The 7-stage collapse survival guide documents this exact progression from artificial stability through escalating crisis to inevitable collapse. Currency pegs are stage 3. Governments maintaining an illusion of control that creates the conditions for stage 4. Understanding where you are in this cycle matters more than predicting specific dates. Today, several countries are defending currency pegs or managing exchange rates that look increasingly unsustainable. Turkey has spent over $100 billion of reserves defending the lira since 2018. Argentina has imposed capital controls to prevent peso outflows. Pakistan's rupee is held artificially strong despite depleting reserves. Each of these situations mirrors Britain in September 1992. The peg requires policies the economy can't handle. Reserves are depleting. Political will is fracturing. Traders are circling. Turkey's case is particularly striking and mirrors Britain 1992 almost exactly. Since 2018, Turkey has kept the lira stronger than fundamentals suggest through constant central bank intervention. This required high interest rates to attract foreign capital and prevent lira outflows. But President Erdogan has an unorthodox view of monetary policy. He believes high rates cause inflation rather than cure it. This is the opposite of conventional economics accepted everywhere else. The conflict came to a head repeatedly. The central bank would raise rates to defend the lira. Erdogan would fire the central bank governor for raising rates. A new governor would be appointed. The lira would weaken. The new governor would face the same choice: raise rates and risk being fired, or watch the lira collapse. Between 2019 and 2023, Turkey went through 4 central bank governors in rapid succession, each one fired for trying to do the job correctly. Meanwhile, reserves were hemorrhaging. Turkey's official reserves appeared to be around $70 billion in mid-2023, but net reserves after accounting for borrowed dollars and swap lines were negative. Turkey owed more dollars than it held. The central bank was borrowing dollars to create the illusion of reserve strength while spending those borrowed dollars to buy lira and prop up its value. This is financial fraud on a national scale. Traders looking at official reserve figures saw $70 billion. Traders who dug deeper saw negative reserves. The lira was being held up by borrowed money that would eventually need to be repaid. The whole structure was unsustainable. In August 2023, Turkey spent $5 billion in a single week defending the lira. 1 week of spending equal to 7% of official reserves. The pace was unsustainable. By September, the lira had lost 15% of its value despite the intervention. The defense was failing in real life. Turkey is facing its own Black Wednesday. The only question is when the government admits the defense has failed and how many more billions will be burned before that admission. Argentina is further along the same path and has been managing currency decline for decades. The peso has been in managed decline since 2001's catastrophic collapse. Capital controls prevent citizens from converting pesos to dollars freely without government permission. You can't simply walk into a bank and exchange pesos for dollars at the official rate. There are monthly limits, paperwork requirements, and arbitrary denials. This creates 2 exchange rates: the official rate published by the government, and the blue dollar rate, the black market rate you actually pay to get dollars without government permission. In September 2023, the gap between these rates exceeded 100%. The official rate was around 350 pesos per dollar. The blue rate was over 700 pesos per dollar. Everyone knows the official rate is fiction, maintained only for government accounting and public statistics. Real transactions happen at the blue rate. This gap signals that the official rate is politically determined rather than market determined. The government maintains the fiction that the peso is worth twice its actual value. Citizens and businesses cope by using the black market. The government pretends this isn't happening while simultaneously cracking down on dollar trading. In the weeks before Argentina's August 2023 presidential election, the government spent $3 billion of reserves, nearly 20% of remaining reserves, intervening in currency markets to stabilize the peso and create an illusion of stability for voters. It worked temporarily. The peso stayed relatively stable through the election. After the election, with reserves nearly exhausted and the political incentive gone, the peso fell 20% in September. The next government would inherit an empty central bank, a fictional exchange rate, and an impending currency crisis. Pakistan's situation is even more acute and immediate. Reserves fell below $3 billion in January 2023, barely enough to cover 1 month of import payments. For a country of 230 million people dependent on imported fuel and food, this was critical. The rupee had been officially managed, but effectively controlled by the government, setting rates that didn't match market reality. Pakistan received a $3 billion IMF loan in July 2023 with harsh conditions attached. The conditions were designed to force Pakistan to admit reality. Let the rupee float freely rather than managing its value. End energy subsidies that were bankrupting the government. Raise taxes to close the fiscal deficit. Essentially, stop pretending the economy is stronger than it actually is. When Pakistan complied with the first condition and let the rupee float, it immediately fell 30% against the dollar. The managed rate had been 285 rupees per dollar. The floating rate settled around 370 rupees per dollar. Overnight, imports became 30% more expensive. Fuel prices soared. Inflation accelerated past 30%. The population rioted. But this wasn't the IMF destroying Pakistan's economy. This was the IMF forcing Pakistan to acknowledge that its economy had already been destroyed by years of managed rates and depleting reserves. The rupee was already worth 370 to the dollar in reality. The government had been pretending it was worth 285. The IMF loan didn't crash the rupee, it removed the fiction that had been hiding the crash. The pattern is identical across all these cases. Government defends an artificial exchange rate. Defense requires policies that hurt the economy. Reserves deplete, traders attack, government eventually abandons the peg, currency falls, and the economy, freed from the unsustainable peg, begins to recover. The recovery is the important part. Britain's economy did better after Black Wednesday than before. Thailand grew faster after the 1997 crisis than during the artificial boom that preceded it. Currency crises feel catastrophic when they happen, but they're often corrections of policies that were already failing. Soros didn't break the pound. He identified that the pound was already broken. The Bank of England was defending a peg that required Britain to suffocate its own economy. Soros bet that this was unsustainable. He was right. The reason governments fight so hard to defend pegs is not economic, it's political. Admitting the peg is unsustainable means admitting the policy failed. Politicians resign over failed pegs. Central bank governors are fired. The embarrassment is immense. So they defend past the point of rationality, burning reserves and imposing painful interest rates to delay the inevitable. Black Wednesday cost Britain $27 billion and massive political embarrassment. But the alternative, staying in the ERM, would have cost more. The economy would have stayed in recession. Unemployment would have risen further. Eventually the peg would have broken anyway, but with even less credibility remaining. Soros forced Britain to face reality earlier than it wanted. The government called him a speculator, a manipulator, an enemy of Britain. But the enemy was the policy, not the person who exposed it. This is the lesson that applies today. When you see a government defending a currency peg with depleting reserves and rising desperation, the peg will break. The only question is when and how much it costs before breaking. Turkey will abandon the lira defense. Argentina will let the peso float. Pakistan will admit the rupee is overvalued. The governments will call it a crisis. But it's not a crisis. It's the end of a failed policy. The traders betting against these currencies aren't villains. They're recognizing reality. Governments create the conditions for speculative attacks by maintaining unsustainable pegs. Traders exploit those conditions. Blaming traders for currency crises is like blaming firefighters for fires. The real question is not whether these pegs will break. They will. The question is whether you'll be positioned correctly when they do. Those who understand the pattern can protect themselves by diversifying out of vulnerable currencies, holding assets in stable jurisdictions, and recognizing the warning signs before the crisis becomes obvious to everyone. Those who don't will lose substantial wealth when the government finally admits what traders already know, that the currency was overvalued, the reserves were insufficient, and the peg was doomed from the start. History provides clear guidance. Every currency crisis follows the same progression. First, the peg becomes inconsistent with economic fundamentals. Second, reserves start depleting as the central bank defends. Third, speculators identify the vulnerability and build short positions. Fourth, the attack accelerates and reserves hemorrhage. Fifth, the government raises rates and imposes controls in desperation. Sixth, the peg breaks and the currency falls dramatically. Seventh, the economy recovers faster than anyone expected once freed from the unsustainable peg. September 16, 1992 demonstrated that central banks are not invincible. A determined trader with a large enough position can break a currency peg if the peg is unsustainable. Governments tried to prevent future Black Wednesdays by increasing coordination and reserves. It didn't work. Currency crises kept happening because the problem wasn't coordination, it was policy. Soros didn't invent speculative attacks. He executed a well-known strategy perfectly. The mechanics were understood. What was remarkable was the scale and the target. Attacking the Bank of England was considered impossible, until it wasn't. Today, traders use the same strategy Soros used in 1992. Identify a currency peg that's unsustainable. Calculate whether the central bank has enough reserves to defend. Estimate the political will to endure the pain of defense. If the answers line up, attack. Turkey, Argentina, and Pakistan all show the same vulnerabilities Britain showed in 1992. Depleting reserves. Economic policies that contradict currency stability. Political leadership divided on whether to keep fighting. These are the conditions for a successful attack. The difference between 1992 and today is that governments learned nothing from Black Wednesday. They still try to defend unsustainable pegs. They still burn reserves fighting reality. They still blame speculators when the defense fails. And traders still profit from betting against inevitability. George Soros made $1 billion in one day because he recognized what the Bank of England refused to admit. The pound was overvalued, the ERM membership was unsustainable, and no amount of reserves or interest rate increases would change that. The Bank of England spent $27 billion learning this lesson. Other central banks seem determined to relearn it at similar cost. The pattern repeats because the incentives remain the same. Politicians prioritize short-term stability over long-term sustainability. Central banks defend their credibility until reserves run out. Traders bet against denial, and in the end, the peg always breaks. The only variable is the cost of pretending otherwise. This is Decoded Economics. Subscribe to see the future before it arrives.